when you got to start it in. Love is always in the mood for believing in miracles. Let's bring ourselves together into that place in consciousness that knows possibilities, where there are no miracles. There is nothing beyond possibility. There is nothing beyond capability. Where that which appears to us as a miracle is something quite ordinary. There is one life. That life is God. That life is perfect. And that life is our life, right here and right now. That one perfect life expresses itself as all-knowing, all power, and all presence. Whatever there is to be known, it knows. Whatever there is to be done, it is capable of doing. Wherever it needs to be done, it already is. As the divine creates, the only thing it has to work with is itself. So its act of creation is an act of becoming the thing created. The divine has created each and every one of us out of itself, in its image, in its likeness, as its individualized expression of life. Everything, anything that is appropriate to a more complete expression of this life is available to us, through us, as us, according to our belief. So we open ourselves up today to allow our belief to grow. We open ourselves up today to dissolve the veil in consciousness that separates us only by ideas from the perfection that already is. We declare our intention today to grow in wisdom, to grow in understanding, and to grow in the experience of the presence of God. We are grateful to know that it is done unto us according to our belief, because there is a power that responds to us according to our belief. And this word is our statement of belief that divine love is now creating in us, as us, and through us a greater opening through which we experience it. We release this treatment to that perfect law, knowing so certainly it is done, that we say together, and so it is. Once again, I apologize for the audio problems for the past few weeks. hopefully whatever was intermittently coming and going has gone, and then I'll be able to find it. So we'll be back up soon. In the meantime, for those watching on YouTube, the sound quality is going to be a little bit diminished because I'm uploading from the backups. So we're continuing today with our Back to Basics series. January of every year we kind of go back to the beginning to start our growth cycle for the coming year with a foundation. Personally, I find that many times in our culture we start talking about things and we never stop to ask ourselves, well, what do I mean by that? Or we never stop to ask another, well, what do you mean by that? I'm not certain that your definition of whatever that is and my definition of whatever that is are the same. And if you observe communication, human communications, many times people are just talking past one another. They're not understanding each other, but they're talking at one another. I think I might have told you this, that one time when I was working in New York City, we went to a restaurant for lunch. It was near the telephone office I worked in. We used to go there. And one day, two of the workers in the restaurant got into an argument. And one was a busboy was standing out in the middle of the restaurant cleaning the table, and the other was a short order cook behind the counter. And the short order cook had a carving knife in his hand, and he was raising that carving knife, and he was waving it at that busboy, and he was yelling at the top of his lungs. And that busboy, all he had was the rag they wiped the tables in with, and he would take that rag, and he was holding that rag, and he was waving it back, and he was shouting back at that other man. And this was going on to a caught attention of everybody in the restaurant. The entire restaurant got quiet, and everybody was just watching to see what was going on. And the two of them continued on for about another minute, and then they realized that everybody was watching them, and they started to laugh. And the most amazing thing about it was that they were arguing in two different languages. They didn't speak the same language. But somehow their emotions got involved, somehow they got angry with one another, somehow they were shouting back and forth. One was shouting and the other was answering, and neither one of them had a clue as to what the other was really saying. So life is like that. Our society is like that, and we are part of that. So I invite everyone then, as we go through this year together, and as we use these different terms, stop and ask, well, what does that mean to me? What does that word mean to me? What is my concept behind the word? So the words are just verbal expressions of a concept. And the concept is just a mental image. It's just an idea. Your idea and my idea may be entirely different. And yet we use the same word. We use the same word. And we are kind of, I guess, assuming that whatever my definition of the word is, that's what everybody else's definition of the word is when we're engaged in conversation. And that's not so. And we don't know that until we take time to ask for clarification. This is one of the things that you learn in communication skills, is to stop and ask, well, what do you mean by that? I know what I mean by that, but what do you mean by that? So this concept of God then, we go back to at the beginning of every January, because this concept of God is abstract. Right? As Joseph Campbell said, God is not a word, God is a metaphor. God is a metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. Think about that. Every limitation of human consciousness. As human beings, we understand beginning, middle, and end. But that which is the divine was never born and shall never die. As human beings, we understand that there are limits to what we are capable of knowing. And yet we have the divine, which is all-knowing. And as human beings, we understand that our power is limited. There's certain things we can't do physically. We just can't do them. And yet we have the divine, which is all-powerful. So this thing called God, we need to go back every so often we need to go back and sort of poke ourselves with a stick and say, well, but what do I mean by that? I hear this word all the time. I hear it every Sunday. But what does it mean to me? What does this mean to me? And this is what Dr. Holmes is asking us to do in the chapter called The Thing Itself. And he calls it the thing deliberately because it makes us stop and think, well, what does he mean by that? And of course it's a reflection right back to us, well, what do you mean by that? What do I mean by that? So we kind of set up for the month, that what we're doing here is we are going back and we are asking ourselves, have I grown in the last 12 months? Is my concept of the divine the same now as it was 12 months ago? Excuse me, as it was 30 years ago, as it was when I was 5 years old. And what we're looking for is that our concept is expanding, it is changing. It is not a matter of right doing and wrong doing, as Rumi says. Beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. It's not a matter of right doing and wrong doing, but for human beings, it's tough. It's tough for us to change. It's tough for us to admit to ourselves, well, the way that I thought 30 years ago, I don't think that way anymore. I think differently. There's kind of this built-in desire to be right all the time. We try to project that image to one another, and we project that image to ourselves. But our growth, it's vital to our growth that we go back from time to time and ask ourselves, well, wait a second. What is this? What is this? So as small children growing up, depending upon the culture that we grew up in, but we might have had this concept of this old man with a white beard up on a throne somewhere just a little bit past the clouds. And this old man with a white beard, he had a book, and he's writing down everything that we're doing. And he's deciding, is it good or is it bad? And someday we're going to have to explain ourselves to this power in the sky, this deity. And of course, then what human beings did was, we made that into Santa Claus. Santa Claus is an old man with a white beard who has a book, and he writes down, who's naughty, who's nice, and we will get punished or rewarded based on what's in that book. So this is why sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Santa Claus concept of God. Now, again, no right or wrong. It's a place where we start. It's a concept that we have, that the power is out there somewhere. And our job, if you want to call it a job, but our task is to figure out how to stay on the good side of that power, how to please that power. So this is where, at that first level of maturity, the focus is very much on behavior, obeying the rules, obeying the commandments, doing the right thing, not doing the wrong thing. And very much our efforts are an attempt to influence some power that is outside of ourselves to do something for us, Another way to say it is that our goal in life at that level of maturity or at that level of consciousness is to try to manipulate power to get power to do for us what we want it to do. You might think of it as a small child trying to get a parent or a grandparent to give them something. One of my cousins sent me a video on Facebook last week, and it's hilarious. It's a little 6-year-old girl in Ireland who is trying to convince her mother to allow her to go to the pub. And she's just pleading with mom, and she's arguing with mom, and she's giving mom all these reasons why she should be allowed to go to the pub. So think of a small child trying to have their way, trying to figure out, trying to find the right button to push, the way to get mom to to do what she wants. And of course, if that doesn't work, she'll go to Dad. And then if that doesn't work, well, of course, she'll go to Grandma. So our concept of the divine, or our concept of whatever this is, whatever this thing is that is out there, when we first start out, it's very foreign to us. It's very far away from us. We are separated from it. We are afraid of it, right? You hear a lot of times, you must be afraid of God. We are afraid of it because it has the power of life and death over us, can give us an eternal reward or eternal punishment. And we don't really get to understand it, and we don't really kind of get to love it or to grow fond of it because it's a frightful thing. And this is what we are trying to look back at and say, has my concept evolved over time? As I have grown, has my concept evolved over time? So Dr. Holmes, in the beginning of this chapter, he says, we all look forward to the day when religion and science shall walk hand in hand from the visible to the invisible, from the visible to the invisible. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to walk from the visible into the invisible. Right? So we can't see through the normal senses. We can't see and touch and feel the invisible. You can't see life. You can see the activity of life, but you can't see life. Life is this invisible, intangible quality that animates all of us. The trees and the flowers and the animals and us. But we can't really see life itself. We can only see the activity of life. And I'm reminded, if you look in the New Testament, there's a line where Jesus says, no one has seen the Father except through the Son. No one has seen life, but you can see the activity of life. You can see the expressions of life. So we're trying to walk from the visible, what we can see, and we are trying to, at first mentally, and then experientially, we are trying to move ourselves back past the expression, to the thing itself, So Dr. Holmes, in another book somewhere, perhaps in a textbook later on, he gives us this visual image that I would really like everybody to kind of create in your mind, this visual image, and keep it there as we go through this month together. And he says that out in Colorado there is a valley, and in the valley there are numerous streams of waters that are just bubbling up from the ground. And some of them are narrow and they squirt high up in the air, and some are bigger around, and they don't go up quite as high, but more water comes out of them and flows out of them. Excuse me, some squirt off at an angle. I have to apologize over the coughing. I'm going to get a cough drop in here. Some go off at an angle, It's just, each one is unique. Each one is different. And he says, but the source of those columns of water, the source of those little springs of water, is the same. There's a lake high up in the mountains, and the water comes down through cracks in the mountain. The water comes down from that lake down into the valley. Excuse me again, I get some water. Where it finds an outlet in the rocks, finds little cracks in the rocks, and it starts to come out and squirt up. And what Dr. Holmes is telling us is that each one of us, you and I and each one of us, we are one of these individualized expressions of the source. Just as the water coming out of the ground is an individualized expression of the lake, each one of us is an individualized expression of the source. Now, what determines the size and the shape of the flow of water the volume of water, the height, the angles, all those things. What determines that is the opening through the rock, the opening through the fissure. In other words, the lake itself is not looking down at these individualized streams of water and saying, oh, I like this one, I will let this one go higher than that one. Or I don't like that one so much, so it's only going to be a little trickle. As far as the lake is concerned, it's not going to make that decision. It doesn't make those decisions. It doesn't make that judgment. All it knows is that it is expressing, if a lake can know, all it knows is that it is expressing itself uniquely through each and every one of these outlets. So I invite you to kind of keep that in mind and play with that during the week, and maybe take some time and sit somewhere and visualize that and really kind of get a feel for this idea that whatever this thing is, whatever this thing that we call God or the divine or spirit or nature or love, whatever word we choose to call it, but whatever it is expressing itself as us and through us. So there is no separation. There is no need for us to try to manipulate it, because the gifts have already been given. The gifts have already been given. It is the Father's good pleasure to give to us, because we are expressing its life. We are doing its work, if you want to think of it in those terms here. So science and religion then, according to Dr. Holmes, we are trying to walk together from the visible, from what we see, into the invisible. So in this line of reasoning, we have to remember that we're using a line of reasoning that the divine does not have to use. We are looking at things as we perceive them, and we are trying to make assertions and statements and develop an understanding about where they came from. Now the divine doesn't have to do that because it already knows. See, so it just knows. So as we start to move back, from the visible to the invisible, as I mentioned, to walk that razor's edge, to use the intellect to tell us that there's a place where the intellect doesn't work. There's a place before where the intellect can even begin. But we can experience it because we are the witness, we are the observer. And this is similar to the physicist saying we can go all the way back to the Big Bang. We can see things expanding and assume that they started someplace, and we can kind of work our way back to an origin that they call the Big Bang. But what happened before the Big Bang started? What caused the Big Bang? Physics can't tell us, because the laws of physics as we know them did not exist. Excuse me. So in this regard, the physicist and the mystic are walking hand in hand. The physicist and the mystic are saying there's something there, there's something beyond, there's something before. And we want to know what that is. We want to experience it. We can't know it intellectually, we can't get our mind around it. It's not a math equation. But nevertheless, it is. So the first thing that we can kind of assume as we think about this thing called life or this thing called God is that it is one. There's not many gods, there's not God and anything else. There is just the divine. And it is expressing itself through all of its creation. And how does it do that? So what is this thing, and then how does it create? What is this thing and what is it doing? So the world religions, if we look at the world religions and philosophies and what they think, what they can come to, probably the closest that we can come is to say that this thing is all-knowing, it is all-powerful, and it is all-presence. But yet there's even something before that, right? We would say that it is not those things as much as it is expressing itself in those ways. It just is. It just is. It is just a singularity. It is just a suchness. It is just the I amness. But it is conscious. It is aware. It is self-aware. It is, and it knows that it is. It knows, and it knows that it knows. So it is a thinking being. And the way that it creates is it decides what it shall have. And then it has it. I'm going to talk about how it has it in best of our understanding in just a moment. But it is through an act of will, an act of choice, an act of volition that it creates, decides what it shall have, and it has it. Now, we have to stop right here, and we have to think about, can this perfect whole, can this oneness, can this thing called God or this thing called life, can it want something not like itself, unlike itself? It is perfect harmony because everything is part of it. Can it choose discord? And it cannot. It cannot. It cannot do anything that is not aligned with its nature. And this is an important thing for us to consider in our growth. And this is something that I mentioned. If you've seen the little booklet that I wrote years ago, called The Riddle. There's a chapter in there called The Riddle of the Rock. And I told you, one of the schoolboys I walked to school with had a cousin who was studying to be a Jesuit, and the Jesuit would share all these philosophical questions with his cousin, and one of them was, can God do anything? And of course, you gotta imagine us all in the 5th grade now, kind of walking through this little town I grew up in, heading our way to the parochial school. And our buddy pulls up next to us, starts walking along, and he says, "Hey, can God do anything?" And of course, we all said, "Absolutely, absolutely." The nuns told us that God is all-powerful. God can do anything. He said, "Well, can God make a rock so big that he couldn't pick it up?" And we said, well, sure, he can do anything. He could make a rock so big he couldn't pick it up. And he had us trapped, right? He said, aha, if he can't pick up that rock, he can't do everything. And we said, well then no, he can't make a rock so big he can't pick it up. And he said, aha. Then there's something he can't do. He can't make a rock so big he can't pick it up. And of course this just totally destroyed our mindset on the way to school. We wanted to change the subject. And it sounds like a nonsensical question, but the point that it is getting to is the divine cannot do anything that is not in accord with its own nature. It cannot do anything that is not in accord with its own nature. It's very important for us to remember that, because in this regard then, whatever it creates is, as we are told in Scripture, is in its own image and in its own likeness. But it created us to make our own decisions, to make our own determinations about what size and shape of a stream of water, of a spring of water coming up out of that valley floor, how is it that we, because we have also been given free will, how is it that we are going to participate in that creative process? And in order for us to have that freedom of choice, in order for us to be able to kind of create something unique, we were not born in full awareness of our spiritual nature. We were born into a belief of separation. Whereas they might tell us in the East, we have had ignorance heaped upon us. And who heaped the ignorance, and why did they heap ignorance upon us? The point is that when we came into the world, if we were to be allowed to develop our uniqueness, we had to forget. We had to forget our magnificence temporarily. So in some traditions that we were studying, there's a mythology that the souls, as souls, we exist in this, I call it the green room, the place where the actors wait to go on stage. We're assembled in the green room, and we decide that we want to come to this plane, to this planet, and there's something that we want to express, to experience, to learn, to do, to enjoy. And at that time we are dispatched into a womb. But we're accompanied by an angel, and that angel is with us, and that angel is telling us everything that we're going to need to learn, everything that we're going to need to do while we're here on this earth. And once we are ready, the angel takes its finger and it hits us on the lip, right underneath the nose. And of course, according to the story, that's where that little dent that we all have right under, on our top lip, right under our nose, that's where it comes from. And at that moment we forget. We forget almost everything. And we come into the world in this state of forgetfulness. And then we spend our lives awakening from that forgetfulness. And as we awaken from that forgetfulness, we are developing our uniqueness. We are developing our uniqueness. Joel Goldsmith puts it another way. He says in the book of Genesis, we are told that God put Adam into a deep sleep. But we're not told anywhere that Adam ever woke up. Waking up is our job. Waking up is something that we individually have to do. So while we are living in this temporary state of ignorance, this false belief of separation, while we are living in the Adam dream, we experience things that the divine cannot. We experience sickness, we experience suffering, we're experiencing all these things. But they cannot be God ordained, because the divine can't even know anything about them. So they are just temporary experiences that we have. We're not saying they're not real, but what we're saying is they're not necessary. They do not have the power to sustain themselves. There are temporary conditions that eventually will leave us. They will leave us as we grow in wisdom and understanding, as we grow in our experience of the divine. We had a lady come to our center back in the 90s, and she talked about the Aboriginal people in Australia. And she said that whenever someone in the tribe was depressed, feeling low, the way that the other people would help them is to ask them, do you know how long forever is? Do you know how long forever is? See, in that culture, people believe they came from the dream time, this ante-room in this other tradition I was telling you about. We come from the dream time. We come to this place for a holiday. We come to this place for a vacation. We come for a wonderful experience, and we go back to the dream time. We go back to the dream time. And while we are going through the experiences here on earth, we forget how long forever is. We think that this experience that we are having here is the only experience. It is all that there is, and we lose sight of forever. We lose sight of the fact that in terms of forever, in terms of eternity, that the trials and the tribulations and the sufferings that we go through in this life will all be forgotten because they were just like a dream. We experienced it, but it wasn't real. It didn't have the power to sustain itself. And as long as we're talking about concepts of God, this whole thing we're talking about, the theologians would call the problem of evil. I mean, if God is good, where does evil come from? If God made everything in its own image and likeness, and we have evil, then God must be evil. That's the problem of evil. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm saying that that's the way the problem is stated. And I think you can learn more about a specific system of belief by exploring that question than you can by asking people, what is it that you believe? What is your religion all about? You just simply ask them, where does pain and suffering come from? And the ideas across the different cultures are not too awfully different when it comes to that. If you look at the cultural background, primarily the religions in the United States, Judaism into Christianity, they call it Judeo-Christian, which I don't know that it actually exists, but that's what it's called. And the idea is that through sin, you see, suffering entered the world. Through the sin of Adam, suffering entered the world. So there's this idea that sin, which is a mistake in thinking, do the wrong thing, because people do the wrong things, the suffering enters the world. If we go to the East, we say, well, it's because of ignorance. It's just simply because we don't know any better. We haven't learned any better yet, so we're acting out of ignorance, and as long as we're acting out of ignorance. Excuse me, I'm going to get rid of this cough drop. As long as we're acting out of ignorance, we do things to ourselves that bring pain and suffering to ourselves. And if we look over to the idea of karma, then we would say, well, everything we experience is a result of what we think and what we believe. Our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs. And because we have done things in the past that were not good, not life-enhancing, well, we tend to bring these things to ourselves. Ideas not too dissimilar, Let me restate the Buddha. Our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and actions are the cause of the pain and suffering, which is in sin, the concept of sin. Wouldn't that be erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and actions? You see? And why would we do such a thing? We would do it out of ignorance. So we want to stop and think for a moment that all of these different concepts and ideas and images of God that human beings have created, we have created those. We have tried to take that which is in itself undefinable, in itself ineffable, and we have tried to describe it. And we are like the blindfolded men who are examining the elephant and trying to describe it to one another. We each grasp a little piece and we say, oh, it's like this. Another will say, no, it's like that. Another will say, no, it's this other thing. But it's all of the above and more. It is all of the above and more. So Dr. Holmes says to us, to think that the divine could create us in bondage and leave us bound would be to dishonor the divine. To think that God would put us into bondage and leave us bound would be to dishonor the divine, because we are part of it. And if it were to put us in bondage and leave us bound, it would be putting itself in bondage and leaving itself bound. And it says, he goes on to say, and to think that the divine could create us to develop our individuality without somehow leaving us in the dark for a while is an impossibility. Right? We couldn't be born fully enlightened, fully awakened, fully aware of what God is and what we are, and still develop our uniqueness. We would be more or less, he calls it automatons or robots. So there's this period of temporary separation, and in some teachings it's a self-imposed separation. Excuse me. That is, we have deliberately removed ourselves from this experience of the divine, which would be in mythology would be similar to the Garden of Eden. We have removed ourselves from this place of walking with God in the cool of the evening to come into the world to have an experience. Excuse me again. And in order to do that, we had to temporarily forget. We had to temporarily forget. We had to have the angel tap us on the lips so that we temporarily forget. So there's all these different ways that people try to understand it and try to explain it. But the bottom line is that we are not born fully aware. And because we are not born fully aware, we misuse the very power that would set us free. And because we misuse the very power that would set us free, we experience pain and suffering. So Dr. Holmes likens it to using a burner on the stove. If we misuse the burner on our stove, we can bring calamity to ourselves. We can burn ourselves, we can burn our house down, we can do all kinds of things. But if we use it properly, then we can have a beautiful meal. So just think of ourselves then as part of this thing that is conscious, it is aware, it knows what it shall have, and then what happens is there is a part of it, excuse me, acting as law. We would call it the law of mind. There is part of it that makes it so. So I always think of the Star Trek show with Jean-Luc Picard, who said, "Make it so, number one, make it so." So the divine mind, the will, the volition, the choosing part of the divine mind decides how it would experience itself. And then there's another part of it that operates as more or less a blind force, as law. And it does whatever needs to be done. It's all powerful. It too is intelligent, but it has no will or volition of its own. It is subjective in that it does what it is told to do. Excuse me again. So this is love and this is law. This is love and this is law. The love is the spontaneous part of deciding how to express. The law is in the way that it unfolds. If we think of evolution, evolution is an unfolding. Involution is the cause. So the divine says, let there be plants and animals and trees and people and oceans and stars and planets. And then these things come about. But we know that they come about in what we experience as time. There's an unfolding. And there's a stage of development where life goes through, and it moves through the single-celled animals, the multi-celled animals, and on and on and on. But throughout all of life, because all of this life comes from the same place, there is a synergy, there is a harmony, there is an order, there is an unfoldment. So Dr. Holmes says it would be a great mistake for us to think that God is spontaneous and love, but without order, right? Without the law, because it would just be chaos, because God would say one day I want to do this, and the next day I want to do that. So the purpose of the will is to choose what to have. And then the purpose of the subjective, or the law of mind, is to make it so, to let it unfold. And what we are asked to remember in this chapter is that we are part of that. That is, it's not enough for us to say, well, in the beginning was God, and God said, let there be, and there was. As true as that is, maybe not in the literal sense of happening in 6 days and all those things, but everything that we see was created because of a desire in the divine mind to express itself in a certain way. And then law, acting upon that desire, made it so. And what Dr. Holmes tells us, and where we want to end for today, we want to kind of get to this point where we can stay with this for a week until we continue next week. Remember I said this is like one talk that goes through a whole month. Excuse me. Is that we are part of that. We are created in its image and likeness. We have willpower. We have the power to choose. We have volition. We can decide. And once we do, then there is a subjective part of us. Actually, it is the subjective part of the whole that is functioning where we are as we are, that then receives that direction from our conscious mind and does what needs to be done to bring about the circumstances in our lives. Love and law. Love is the spontaneous choosing, law is the unfolding. And we can't have one without the other. So sometimes we want to think of God as this perfect love, and God will change the rules and do whatever needs to be done to accommodate me if I pray hard enough or in the right way. And other times we say, no, God is this pure blind force. There's no sense even praying, because you're not going to change the blind force, any more than you could change gravity by praying to gravity. So you just have to learn how to cooperate with the blind force. But then we have to merge the two. Thomas Troward, in his book Bible Mysteries and Bible Meanings, relates this to the two pillars in front of the Temple of Solomon. It also, another way to think of it is that the lintel over the door, there's two doorposts and there's a lintel across the doorpost in Exodus, and when people had to write on the lintel. We have the love and we have the law, but what binds them together is us, is the individual. It is our conscious use, our conscious cooperation with the way that life works. So then in theory we can say, well, the richness of life awaits, and we can have whatever we want if we learn how to cooperate with this law, which operates according to our belief. And then the issue becomes, well, how do I know what belief is? Remember I started at the beginning and I said we use words and we don't necessarily stop and think about what they mean. What is belief? Is belief something that you're born with? Or is belief something that can be developed? And what is faith? Pray believing in your heart. Where is your heart? How can you pray in your heart? How can you pray believing in your heart? What is this trying to tell us? But in general, what it's trying to tell us is at the subjective level. At the subjective level. So what happens sometimes is, intellectually we say, I want this. But at our subconscious level, if you want to call it that, we don't believe it. We don't believe it. And we say, well, if I don't believe it, I can never have it. No, so what's the sense of saying I believe it? Catch-22. And what we must recognize is that belief is something that we can develop. Faith is something that we can develop. We're going to talk about that more in the upcoming weeks. But what I would like to leave us with today, where we get today, is we have to go back and think about this thing called God. Is it an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne up above the clouds who's looking down upon us and watching everything we do and writing it down in a book? Is it a blind force such as gravity that just simply creates because that's what it does? Or is it somehow a combination of a conscious being that is all love because it is one with everything, that is expressing itself through its creation and us being part of that creation? The creation starts with an intention. Right? In the beginning, God said. The creation starts with an intention. And then because the divine cannot doubt itself, as we can doubt ourselves, the divine cannot doubt itself. The law acts upon it perfectly. When we come down to the microcosm, to us, we can decide. We can change our mind immediately, but we can decide. And we can doubt, and our own doubts get in the way. In the Gospel of Thomas, Thomas asked Jesus, he says, where is this kingdom you keep talking about? And Jesus says, it's right here, it's right now, but people don't see it. People don't see it. We're told that Moses brought the people right up to the land of milk and honey, but they couldn't go in because of their fears and doubts. And that generation had to die off. Those old ideas had to die off before they could go in and accept the good that was already there. So for the coming week, I just invite you to stop and think to yourself, when I was a little kid, how did I think of this thing called God? When I was a teenager, how did I think of this thing called God? When I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s, how did I think? And how do I think now? And has my idea changed in the last 12 months? My last year of spiritual growth, has my idea or my concept of God changed? What is this thing called God? How does this thing called God create? If it is the creator, then how does it create? And how does that relate to me? And then we will pick up next week approximately where we left off. And so it is.